Let's try and get as much as we can out of our guest in the next 10 minutes as we analyse some of the big stories this morning. Finance Minister Tito Mboweni has announced plans to recapitalise the SABC, Eskom, Denel and SAA. Eskom will get 59 billion rand over the next 2 financial years, while the SABC will get 3.2 billion rand. Speaking in Parliament yesterday, Mboweni said it's important that SOEs meet certain conditions. The Finance Minister says he'll announce the appointment of Chief Restructuring Officers for the entities today. What exactly does this mean? Political analyst Angelo Fick is with us to give us a little bit more insight into all of this. Good to see you. Welcome.
Yes, good morning.
So we're talking about these bailouts that are coming. I suppose maybe we should start at the beginning. How did our SOEs land up in such a mess, let's say, in these financial messy situations?
So they're different for the different SOEs, but what is important is that there is a different kind of mismanagement in each, but it's mismanagement and maladministration. And this is not just in terms of the last 4 years or the last 8 years, but this has been stuff that's been happening since the 90s. So in terms of Eskom, which is the Energy Supply Commission that has a monopoly on electricity supply in South Africa, we've had alerts since the early 90s, certainly by the late 90s, that there needed to be a plan for change and that plan was not instituted. And so you've seen bailout after bailout after bailout. But if you talk to bankers who are invested in South Africa, so South Africans who work as bankers and senior bankers, they will tell you that you cannot not bail out Eskom in one form or the other, because the economy requires it, and the economy will certainly collapse for 58 million people if you don't have constant electricity supply. And we saw that a few years ago during the load shedding, right? The kind of economic losses then were catastrophic. They would be absolutely death-inducing to the South African state should Eskom not be salvaged. The SABC is another very important aspect, and so people think of it as the kind of entertainment. But there are actually constitutional provisions that South Africans have the right to be informed, and the public broadcaster plays a very important role in that, particularly across its radio stations. And so not having that would certainly infringe on people's constitutional right to information, and therefore saving those two would be, for me, crucial to maintaining a certain level of, shall we say, democracy and governance in South Africa. The Denel and SAA, those are nice to have. They give jobs to thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, but they're not as essential as the previous two. But the maladministration there would certainly have to be watched much more closely. Eskom, of course, this restructuring office that's going to kick in. Really, this is sort of last chance. I don't think South Africans have an appetite for a year from now, or even at the medium-term budget statement, policy statement, for the finance minister to come back and go, well, we're sort of jacking up or increasing our subsidies to these SOEs. Short-term gains have to be crucial.
The problem is when you look at, let's just, as you say, Eskom, SAA, we can understand to a certain extent why you need to have them. You talk to their mandates. I mean, Eskom, in one way, it almost feels like you're throwing money into a black hole. But because the minute you give that money, it's almost just to repay the debt, and there's nothing left of the money that you've already given them. And then, of course, we talk about restructuring, but you're in a bit of a difficult situation because you've got to keep the lights on, and this is a major problem. However, when people hear about giving more money to SAA, more money to Denel, why not just privatize them? It's a story that's been spoken about for a long time, but your views on the privatization of those two specific entities?
So privatization is possibly, an idea to think of for those two, but they have consequences. They're not public sort of service entities, and so there wouldn't be a price hike, for example, for Denel. If there is a price hike, they price themselves out of the market. They're an arms trader. But for South African Airways, there are concerns around what that would mean. But there are also concerns about how that's been managed, because we know from evidence in the State Capture Commission that some of the most profitable routes are run by SAA and they're not run at a profit. And so the question is, how has that come about? We've also heard that SAA gave up on certain routes that were perfectly business positive because of interference, and so that has to be rectified. But the aviation industry globally over the last 50 years has certainly gone through slumps and declines. And so one has to ask questions. So if you look at the number of airlines that were operating in 1980 and you compare them with the number of airlines operating in 2010, many of the national airlines that we all grew up with, if you're older than 40, they've disappeared.
Yeah.
I still have little elements in my house of little things that one got as gifts marked with airlines that don't exist because they were the Greek national airline or they were the national airline of one or other country. So this idea of the national airline is, I think, a pride issue. And one of the economists who work at the University of the Witwatersrand recently indicated that we often imagine and we think of South Africa as a developed economy, and we do need to begin to accept that South Africa is a developing economy. And as a developing country, the nice to haves, which are the glitzy, shiny infrastructure that we say makes us not like other Africans generally, may be things that we should begin to think of letting go, not because we're ashamed, but because our priorities ought to be different. Our priorities ought to be to create employment, not necessarily to create the kind of growth that people seem to be so obsessed with. And having these business success stories that are very, very successful for the investors and the profiteers, but are disastrous for the employees, because what you have is restructuring. We have fewer employees to maximize profits, and that doesn't really contribute in South Africa to the kind of long-term economic growth that is needed to create a population that is vaguely middle class, vaguely stable, and addresses the inequality problem.
So let's talk to the issue of these restructuring officers that are going to be announced today to come into these entities. This is quite an interesting scenario because you sort of ask yourself, okay, what happens to the CEOs in these entities, and why do we even have them when these restructuring officers are going to come in and obviously call the shots? Is this a way of government covering its tracks as well by getting these restructuring officers into these positions as well? And at the end of the day, who will ultimately be responsible for the failure or success of these SOEs? I suppose it's a bundle of questions into one, if we can go there.
So my understanding is that this has to do with restructuring altogether some of these entities, because the restructuring has to do with how they've become too big to fail. And so monopoly on all sorts of infrastructure, for example, in electricity supply, would be a significant planning issue. So in terms of the grid, in terms of distributing cables and pylons, that might be important. But in terms of generation, the need for a monopoly disappeared in 1988, if not earlier. And so the way in which Eskom does the various things that it does needs to be rethought, and restructuring that is going to be significant. With SAA similarly, because remember that there's been this unbundling, rebundling, it's like a flower arrangement. First there was one airline, then there were three, then there were two, then there was one. So those, then there was a budget airline. How many of these multiple businesses are replicating across the same route? And so that restructuring and what happens on smaller routes, and and there is precedent for this. So if you look in places like India, states, for example, have the ability to generate legislation and policy around you can operate one route that is highly profitable, but for reasons of development you have to then take on another route which isn't necessarily as profitable, and that kind of restructuring is going to be crucial. So this doesn't necessarily require massive privatization of the kind that one saw in the 1970s and particularly in the 1980s in places like the United Kingdom and France, because that resulted in disastrous, unbundling of public services that resulted in poor delivery, because profit became the primary motive over the people. Here, I think the two will have to be balanced, and they will have to be balanced with the need to actually grow employment, not reduce it. Because if this restructuring results in large numbers of layoffs,
yes,
what you have is the economic consequences of putting people already in precarious positions in greater poverty. If you balance that with what these restructuring officers will be paid, then I think you sit with a political problem if people are taking on massive salaries. And the Eskom CEOs, CEO class salaries and SOE class salaries, those have been under scrutiny for a very long time, because let's not forget the famous bonuses given to people in the very years of, load shedding, failure to supply electricity consistently to the country, etc., etc.
Yeah, all right. Just you already mentioned that we're going to news, but I think the retrenchments and the job losses is something, if we can end on that note. Do you think with these restructuring officers coming in, I mean, you've got Denel threatening they can't pay salaries, SABC, we've spoken to that almost every single month, saying, is it going to happen this month? Is today the day or not? And, we've managed to obviously get through these times, but how do we carry on running these entities when many say that every single one of them are overstaffed?
Well, that has to do with, functioning, getting people to function differently. So the kinds of jobs that existed 20 years ago no longer exist. And this has to do with how one transitions. And so, those state-owned entities also have to retrain staff in order to redeploy them in different spaces. And this is not that work isn't available. Work does need to be done. It just cannot be done the way it was done 20 years ago. And that kind of micromanagement is part of what has to happen inside all businesses, not just the SOEs. All of South Africa's businesses will have to adapt and transition into new needs, which may not necessarily just be about mechanization and automation, but may be about changing the way in which we think that through.
Angelo, what a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you very, very much for coming in. We didn't even get to the other stories. I think that's the one we needed to focus on. The good news is we will have more analysis in the next hour here on the program. Audrey Machiki is going to be chatting to Sakina, so that's going to be quite an interesting conversation to stay tuned for, and it'll unpack a lot more stories. But right now, it's 7 o'clock.